into rostering someone or having the fear of missing out on someone.
Yeah, I agree. And you don't have to feel pressure that like you see a bunch of people on these types of shows just all week saying that, oh, this guy's 30% owned, get away, whatever it might be. Like there's only, I think, 7 or 8 players above 15% owned, and 15%, at least to me, is defined as just average ownership. So if you have the far majority of the slate being unowned, then yeah, it's a spot where you can really play whoever you want, feel good about it. And you don't have to worry about chalk hitting this week because there really, for the most part, isn't chalk.
Before we go into ownership, because Sal and I, what we like to do is break a few of these guys down who are projected to be highly owned. Want to go ahead and make sure we thank our sponsor, Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports. You guys, this is the first week where they just made their announcement. You can finally do CSV uploading. So if you're trying to multi-enter and you don't want to hand build every lineup, you have that opportunity now. Don't forget the code to use if you haven't got on Yahoo yet and you want to sign up and get $30 in Yahoo Fantasy Sports rewards. The code is AWESEMO, AWESEMO. And if you're looking for a link of how to get there, you can go ahead and go on the articles in the NFL section. There's usually a link where you can just click on the homepage up top, Yahoo Fantasy. You just click it there, sign up, use the code AWESEMO. And what $30 in Yahoo Fantasy Sports Rewards gets you is $3 or 3 entries into that $250,000 baller tournament that they have, $25K up top at front. So if you guys want to use the code AWESEMO, AWESEMO, and it'll take you straight to Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, guys. All right, so ownership. We talked about it just recently. 2 guys over 20%, DeAndre Hopkins, Chris Carson, both in very good matchups. Both guys who, we've seen DeAndre Hopkins over the last few weeks kind of get people a little bit upset with his production, but then this past week finally came alive again, finally gave us those numbers that we saw in week 1 against the Saints, Sal. So DeAndre Hopkins at 8,100 at 20.8%. How do you feel about where the field stands on him, and how do you feel about where you stand on him?
Yeah, so where the field stands on him in a week where, like, if you just talk about it saying he's the most owned player, it might not sound great, but then you look at it, he's only 20% owned. I feel fine with that. I think I'll come in above that, maybe not by much, but if I got 30% DeAndre Hopkins, I wouldn't bat an eye at it. If I had under 20%, I would actually probably try and go in and manually adjust a projection or something to try and get a little bit more. It's just a really good spot. And this will be one of the more chalkier stacks of the week, but it doesn't mean I'm getting away from it. There's no Will Fuller, who was top 10 on the slate so far this season in air yards. He's now not out there. Hopkins is going to be forced to just run deeper routes. And sure, Hopkins might see some double coverage, but you just saw Oakland get rid of their quote, probably top cornerback in Conley. And now they're just out there with a secondary that got torn apart last week, continues to struggle. And just a really good spot for Hopkins. The price point's surely up there, so you have to sort of prioritize your lineup around at least the top wide receiver option. But yeah, the ownership doesn't scare me off. I'd probably and will come in as of right now above the 21%.
Let me ask you something about what you just mentioned in Conley, because as we know, Conley, probably Oakland's top corner. You know where he went, right?
Yeah, he went to like this exact team, so it makes sense to also like say what's their weaknesses. Yeah, I got also a piece of it.
Exactly. So I wanted to ask you, in this type of acquisition, when you have someone come over who is somewhat relatively good at what they do at their position, and also knowing the defensive schemes and knowing the defense for the last 6 weeks of the season, or 7 weeks, excuse me, does this give any type of advantage to the Houston offense and Deshaun Watson and being able to pick up different defensive packages? Does this increase the stock of the passing game?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. Like, it's already a great matchup, but there's nothing bad that can possibly happen from having just some insider info. It's not like these players are signing a non-disclosure when they leave. So yeah, I think it's totally fine to expect that. Yeah, there is going to be some information leaked a little bit. I think that helps, and it definitely doesn't hurt. I don't know how much it'll weigh in. Like, these cornerbacks are already bad, but yeah, having a little bit more of a leg up when you're in the film room for the past 5 days or so since Conley's been there is definitely going to be beneficial. To kind of just exploit even more of what these cornerbacks like Trevion Mullen and Worley's weaknesses are, if they already don't have pretty evident ones.
Our next guy, Chris Carson, 7,000, going into Atlanta at 20.4%. Atlanta, not really the worst when it comes to rushing defense. However, though, when it comes to the offense of the Seahawks, they can get you in both ways, through the air or through on the ground. Chris Carson has really proved to us, not only this season, but over the last few weeks, that he is the workhorse, that he is the primary running back. And there's really no one that's going to threaten him to take his job, regardless if he slips a couple more times or if he fumbles. As you guys have known, early on in the season, there were people saying that Chris Carson will get benched. Chris Carson will be done if he fumbles one more time. But what we've seen lately, Sal, is that last week, Rashad Penny didn't even touch the ball. There was no carries, no catches. And now we have Carson, who has been getting a heavy workload going into Atlanta, where I feel that this game, especially depending upon Matt Ryan as well, I don't think it would be as competitive from both sides of the ball than what people are maybe anticipating. But I think that this is a great game for Chris Carson, especially with the game flow. But at his price point at 7,000, does it justify and warrant the ownership at being the projected second overall player right now on DraftKings?
Yeah, so I actually think I disagree with this a little bit in terms of it being 20% is fine, but in terms of it being higher than some other guys in his range by a decent amount, if you take a look at just Le'Veon Bell and some other guys in that range, I think I disagree with it there when it comes to my lineups. I'll have guys at equal or greater ownership than Chris Carson. When you look at it based on just the slate and it being 20% for a running back who, yeah, you said it, even with Penny coming back last week, this coaching staff doesn't believe in Penny, and they're kind of tied in really deeply right now with believing in Chris Carson. This is a week where Carson could see 25 attempts. You mentioned this Atlanta run defense has been better. If Matt Ryan, which people are expecting him to play, so if he plays, then fine, it's an okay spot. If Matt Ryan doesn't play, then yeah, Chris Carson's ownership at 20%. Honestly, I probably want more than that. But right now, I'm fine coming in around it, or honestly, maybe even a little bit under, around 15%. It's really going to depend on how much of Le'Veon Bell and Leonard Fournette I get. I expect to have more Leonard Fournette than Chris Carson, and then Le'Veon Bell at the final crunches of mine will kind of determine where I'm on Carson. I think 20% is not over-owned. I might come in at it more times than not. I'd probably come in around maybe 15%. It's a good volume, tough matchup.
20 plus carries the last 4 games for Carson, and also in that getting pass catching opportunities for averaging about 4 targets per game across those 4 games as well. So it really comes down to if Matt Ryan plays, I'm really trying to consider where ownership will go, because if he doesn't, I don't see Matt Schaub coming in and having a stellar game. I feel like with the Seahawks defense, there are some areas of strength there. However, though, they have been burned in the passing game as well. But I will say that I feel like this is a game that Seattle kind of controls it, and I could see Chris Carson still getting that heavy workload and him paying off that 7,000 price tag. Our next guy, Sal, Michael Thomas, 8,000, coming in at 18.1% right now. Going to get a matchup at home against Arizona, which is a good matchup. However, though, he will be covered by Patrick Peterson. So let me ask you this. The Saints kind of have established a game plan like I spoke about on yesterday's show. It's basically run the ball and throw it to Mike Thomas. Not a lot of other wide receivers are getting a lot of targets, nor are they getting opportunities to score. It seems that everything's going to Mike Thomas. So is this an area where you are a little bit kind of shaky with the matchup, or is this just a must play in Mike Thomas's production?
Yeah, I mean, I prefer Hopkins on the top end. He's slightly higher owned, but if it's going to be that close, I'll have a wider gap and have more ownership to Hopkins. Like I said, I'll probably come in maybe around 30% on Hopkins, if not a little bit more. And then that'll just leave Michael Thomas to be really where he's at right now at the ownership, match the field, maybe come in 15%. It's a good matchup for Thomas in terms of how they use him. Like he's caught about over a third of his receptions so far out of the slot. Patrick Peterson doesn't work into the slot, but for half the game, you'd expect maybe a little bit more Patrick Peterson to be on him. So that hurts, but just pure volume here. No Jared Cook still. Alvin Kamara is a game time decision questionable, but they have a bye coming into week 9. So there's a really good chance Kamara, they just rest him and Breeze. I do think that Michael Thomas is a fine play. I prefer for $100 more in similar ownership Hopkins by a decent amount. That doesn't say you can't have both of them, but if you are playing one lineup, I do and I will have Hopkins over Thomas. When it comes to just exposures, I'll probably see like a 10 to 15% gap and having more Hopkins. And a lot of that will be bumped up just from team and game stacks. I'm going to be team and game stacking the Oakland and Houston game, as many other people will probably be. Whereas the Saints game against Arizona, I'm just not going to game stack that one. I don't really see any other options unless Kamara does play to pair with a Michael Thomas and a Bridgewater. So, yeah, I think that 18% is fine. I'd expect just from crunches, I'll come in around there, maybe just slightly less. But I think it's a good spot for him because the way that Sean Payton will move him around the offense.
Mike Thomas, he has 8 catches or more in every game so far this season. Basically has been unguardable in every matchup that's been presented to him. This will be a tough test with Patrick Peterson, but right now the level of talent of where he's at and kind of how he runs his routes, I think, no matter what, it doesn't matter. I think his talent is superior to any type of defensive scheme or coverage matchup. So Michael Thomas, I think, both these guys, when it comes to Michael Thomas and DeAndre Hopkins, definitely have the same amount of upside, in my opinion. The better matchup is probably in Hopkins right now. However, though, I don't mind going to either one or, trying to figure out how much exposure you'd have to each. I think they're both great plays. Next
Yeah.
guy is DeAndre Hopkins' counterpart, Kenny Stills. As we know, Fuller will be out with an injury. Kenny Stills steps into that wide receiver 2 role, 4,700, Sal. We talked about this matchup already with Oakland, but he's coming in at 18%. So this is one of the cheap plays. And is this the right cheap play at 18% projected ownership?
Yeah, I think it is. So yeah, we have a ton of cheap wide receivers in the 4K range. Honestly, like the most I've ever seen, there's probably like 7 guys you can make a viable case for in the 4K wide receiver range alone. Which for me at least leaves me to think that it's a contrarian week to where these top end running backs aren't being owned and you can get to them a lot easier. So yeah, I think Kenny Stills, it should kind of scream out that when 2 of the top 4 players on the slate in ownership are from the same team and same position, it's probably going to be a heavy stack there. So I think Kenny Stills is fine. Yeah, I do prefer him in stacks. I even think he's cash game viable at $4,700. He's probably going to have a matchup against Daryl Worley, just depending, or just when you take into account size matchups and weight and things like that. Worley's given up 265 yards, 2 touchdowns, 19 receptions. He's a slower cornerback. We know Kenny Stills has a lot of speed, so there's an advantage there. Watson can buy time in the backfield. Stills is going to take on that Will Fuller role in this offense on the outside, play 90+% of the snaps. 18% ownership, yeah, I'm not scared. Like if this was a normal week where chalk is 28, 30%, then I start considering, oh, there's so many guys in the 4K range, but it's 18%. And I feel fine coming in right around probably 20, 25% until be propped up in my exposures just because of being a top stack option. This Houston game for me is right now a top 2 stack team for me, and it potentially can end up being the highest by tomorrow.
Let me ask you this. When it comes to the coverage, who sees who? Because I want to be able to say that when it comes to attacking certain corners, do you think Daryl Worley or do you think Trayvon Mullen will be guarding Hopkins and Stills?
Yeah, so I think you're going to have Mullen going to be on DeAndre Hopkins just because of the size differences. And then also, it should be noted that like Hopkins is going to face double teams, but that doesn't really matter when he's like slanting into the middle of the field and it won't be 100% of the game. So when there is one-on-one coverage on Hopkins, I mean, it'll be very not often, but when they have that, it'll be Mullen. And then I do expect Worley to be on Kenny Stills just based on where these guys play on the sides of the fields. And then you just take into the dimensions of the type of player they are. So I think it's still a great matchup for both guys. And honestly, it's probably Stills that has the better matchup because he won't see anywhere near as many double teams.
So, these 2 guys are highly owned. And as you know, there have been some times this year where people have pivoted to Kiki Kuti. And so I want to ask you, I mean, he's not up here in ownership. However, though, he has always played into this role as a third wideout. And, as we know, Kenny Stills is getting this huge bump because he does have explosive playability and he does have upside of getting those big plays, as we saw last week, 4 catches for over 100 yards. But Kiki Kuti is coming in at sub 5%. And so I want to ask you, with the way that this offense will be running and so much ownership is gravitating towards Kenny Stills, Kiki Kuti right now on DraftKings projected to be sub 5%, Sal, at 4,100. And so I want to ask you, is there any logic or any type of strategical approach with pivoting to Kiki Kuti aside from Kenny Stills?
So I think that there is when you consider ownership. I don't think it's high enough for me to want to get there. The main concerns for me with Qt are that he has a 9 air yards per target. Kenny Stills is about 5 yards more, so just more upside in those targets. But it's more so a role change for Kenny Stills. And I like to look for role changes. So the guy in Kenny Stills will move from a slot wide receiver to now to the outside into Will Fuller's role, which has been very productive. And if Will Fuller can just catch a couple more of wide open passes, 2 or 3, it's a huge season for Fuller. It's been a very productive role in terms of that Texans offense, where the slot really hasn't been. They've been using a lot of more 2 tight end sets. They've been using their tight ends more frequently in the red zone. So it's hurting the value of Stills when he's in the slot and Kiki when he's in the slot. So I think Kiki definitely will see now the primary snaps in the slot. So that's a bit of a role change, you can argue. But overall, how they're going to be used in the offense isn't going to be changed nearly as much as it will for Stills. So yeah, I prefer Stills upside on the outside. Definitely when you consider ownership, like if you're playing a ton of lineups, then I would put Kiki into a group with Houston. But if it's popping up that he's coming into like almost every single one of your stacks because of his price and ownership, then I would make sure to do some manual adjustments because yeah, I want more Stills than Kiki this week.
11 targets for Kiki the last 2 weeks. But I think the biggest thing to note is he's gotten 3 targets in the red zone. So, I mean, there is that upside potentially for him to get in there and score. And I think at 4,100, to be quite honest with you, I don't mind the pivot. You're also saving a little bit of money. But if you want to have a few shares of Kiki, I don't think there's anything wrong with going down and seeing an opportunity of a man that's going to be probably playing a lot in the slot. and getting some red zone targets to make us feel confident in rostering him. Next guy, Sal, Leonard Fournette. I mean, there's really not much to say with why and what we've been doing with Fournette over the last couple of weeks. 7,800 on DraftKings. Going to be at home against a Jets rush defense that, thought it was somewhat solid, but as we saw the Patriots kind of dismantle them on the running ground. He's 17.9% projected ownership here. And I would love to hear what you have to think about Fournette this week, because the last 2 weeks had really good matchups, Sal. Last week against one of the worst rush defenses in the entire league in almost every statistical category in the Bengals, but didn't really hit the value that we were looking for. Although he did salvage himself, but it just wasn't. We could have got that production elsewhere at a cheaper price. So how do you feel this third straight week with Fournette being one of the highest guys on the board?
Yeah, so where his ownership is, I'm fine on it because of his role. I do think it's a tougher matchup than people are leading on. This Jets defense being poor against the run the past couple of weeks, they've been dealing with 2 to 3 injuries in their front seven that are now or should be fully healthy. We'll see what CJ Mosley's status is. I don't know if there was an update on that. Actually, I can check right now if he's already ruled out or if he's going to be probable. I saw game time decision last, but depending on that status, that'll help a little bit. This offensive line in the run blocking game is one of the worst advantages for Fournette, and it has been all season. That's why he's been, and also just his ability to break, or not break tackles, but find holes and hit them as a reason why sort of his ineffectiveness on those carries, but it's been improving lately. I think it's fine. Like the ownership, I don't want to have 10%. I feel way too thin there. Around 20% is fine. The way I'm building my lineups, at least right now, is I think there's a ton of value at wide receiver. And if there's nobody that wants to own, or very few people compared to most weeks are going to be owning Saquon and McCaffrey, then I'll just use that to get some sort of leverage on those guys. I also like in the same price range, which we'll talk about sooner or a little bit later, is a guy like Todd Gurley. So I'm not going to be a week where I have 30, 40% Leonard Fournette. I think it's fine if you get there. I'm just building my lineups a little bit differently this week. But where the ownership is, I think it's totally fine for the role that he plays in the offense.
I mentioned that last week the Jets kind of got exposed on the rushing ground. To me, when it comes to getting exposed on the rushing ground, if you're giving up 3 touchdowns to a running back, I mean, I got to say that you failed at really stuffing the line of scrimmage and getting to the running back. So, Sony Michel last week, yeah, he had 19 carries for 42 yards. But I mean, let's look at where he really excelled was that he scored in the end zone. And I mean, they didn't really have to do much, the Patriots. So the way that they kind of ran the ball and the way that they kind of moved down the field, I mean, at the end of the day, if we can get that type of production from Leonard Fournette, where, I feel that, we'll get into it when we get into this game, but I think this passing game for the Jacksonville Jaguars has a lot of upside this week, and they're not getting a lot of ownership. But if there are big plays happening to these wideouts and they're getting into the red zone, I mean, look to Leonard Fournette to getting a bulk of these carries or these touches inside the red zone, which is what we want to see out of a running back.
Yeah, I agree. And Leonard Fournette right now, I mean, we keep saying it for his touchdown to just keep coming up, but he continues. I mean, 3 times he's been stuffed on the 1-yard line on carries this year, and he continues to get red zone carries. He has tied for the slate high with 24. It's only going to continue to see 3 to 4 a week, and eventually it'll start breaking through. So yeah, where the ownership is, if you want to come in over it, it's fine. If you're building your lineups a different way and you're right at it or barely under it, I think that's also okay. I don't think there's based on the price point coming up, that you have to have, like we had in previous weeks, like a 50, 60% Leonard Fournette to feel good about it.
One more guy that we'll talk about here in the ownership that's kind of shooting up. He's at 4,900. Is Ty Johnson for Detroit, playing against the Giants. 17.1% projected ownership for this running back, Sal. As we know, Kerryon Johnson will not be playing, and so this guy is now the next man called up. How do we feel about rostering Ty Johnson at 17.1%? And is it okay to go at that kind of with the field with this price point at 4,900?
Yeah, so it's actually a bit concerning to me. So yeah, the price points why he's kind of getting this role in this ownership with no Kerryon Johnson. I want to see what Detroit does tomorrow, because there's a chance Detroit can have 4 active running backs, and if that's the case, they're probably going to use 2 to 3 of them more times than not. They called up Paul Perkins from the practice squad. They have 4 guys practicing at running back this week. I agree that Ty Johnson is the best of these 4. I think he's the one who should see the most opportunities, but you're paying 4,900, which is a fine price point, but you're also paying for a guy who's above average ownership and becoming chalkier by the day. Like earlier this week when Lofty and I did the show on, I think it was Tuesday, or actually I think it might have been on Thursday, he was only like 8% owned, and now he shot up to 18%. If that keeps coming up, I mean, my stance is going to be that I'm just not going to play him at a popular ownership number, and not as much. I'll have some, but the main reason why is he can go out there, and a good day for him might actually just be 12 touches. with how many guys they have back there and how this offense in the passing game stacks up against the Giants. So it's a spot where I don't even know if I trust him to get 15 touches, let alone 12. So it's worrisome for me that his ownership's coming up. I'm probably going to be under the field on it. I like the kid a lot. I think he has big play upside, but there's a really good chance he sees only 50% of the snaps here. And if they have 4 running backs active, and that's something that people need to watch, then yeah, it's going to be a spot where I don't have as much.
So I'm not giving any love to this guy, Ty Johnson. Played 49 snaps last week, 10 attempts rushing, 2.9 yards per carry, right? And the thing is that, yeah, he got 4 catches, he got 4 targets for 28 yards. Okay, that's great. But here's the thing, is that this team is pass dominant, okay? And they have a beautiful matchup this week, okay, against the New York Giants, against a secondary that we love to target, that's inexperienced, young. There's a lot of vulnerability there. Matt Stafford coming off his highest passing game of the season last week. Okay, we saw Marvin Jones score 4 touchdowns against a pretty stiff Vikings defense when it comes to the passing game. And now they're going to get a great matchup at home against this Giants defensive secondary, where I feel that's where they'll win this game, is attacking through the air. I think Galladay is going to be in play. I think Jones is in play yet again. I mean, even TJ Hawkinson. And I think that the game plan is pretty simple, is pass the ball and, give little touches to Ty Johnson when you can. I don't see any upside in Ty Johnson in comparison to maybe like what we saw last week with Latavius Murray. Guys like at that price point that will get a foundation of the carries and someone who's going to play an intricate part in the offense. And you made a great point. If there's 4 running backs that are active, you're looking at more of a running back by committee. And that just doesn't sit well with me. And to be honest with you, when it comes to these type of plays, there's good chalk and there's bad chalk. And if he continues to rise and people are really on him, I kind of want to avoid it. I think that there's place that we can go elsewhere. And one guy that we can talk about is you can pay $300 more for Sony Michel at 5,200 against one of the worst rushing defense in the Browns that we've seen get exposed by a ton of running backs lately. And so be cognizant that I would feel way more comfortable paying that extra 300 for Sony Michel in comparison to paying 4,900 for really an unknown. And you don't really know how they're going to utilize him, nor does he have the level of talent that I think is justifiable to roster him.
Yeah, I think there's definitely viable pivots. You have Sony Michel. You have a guy in Tevin Coleman who probably sees a very similar workload and just as good of an environment for the way that that team wants to move the ball, if not a better environment. So there's definitely pivots there. And that was my case earlier in the week is, yeah, if this guy stays at 7-8%, I think he's a GPP viable guy. He's definitely more of a boomer bust based on the amount of touches we can project for him. But now when he becomes chalky, it's just very easy to pivot to guys who are half the ownership or even less. At the similar price points like Sony Michel, like maybe a James White or a Tevin Coleman, all in that same range. I also think that if Kamara does indeed get ruled out, and if I had a bet, I would say that he is with their bye week coming up, like mentioned earlier, then yeah, it's $900 more for Latavius Murray, but I want that way more because there's a real chance he sees twice as many touches.
Got a question for you, Sal, in the chat. It was a donation from the biggest complainer. Never really had this situation with you before, so figured we might as well address it. But they have a question: Bell versus the Jaguars or Chubb versus Patriots? Full point PPR.
Yeah, it's Bell versus the Jaguars there for me. I think Chubb, like the matchup for him is obviously brutal. It's really hard to just justify it. And there's chances and there's been weeks where, oh, Chubb's unowned. This is where you get the Chubb. And there's been ways that you could poke holes in the defense against him. But I mean, you're almost a 2-touchdown underdog. I think it was 13 going into Foxborough. It's not the greatest of spots for Nick Chubb. And then you have Le'Veon Bell, who I think is actually due for some positive regression. The passing game role, I don't think it's just fallen off a cliff. 2 receptions over the last 2 weeks on 5 targets. It's just the way that they've needed him in those games. They haven't needed to use him in the passing game, or was their team on the field in situations where short passing was needed. Last week against the Patriots, so many turnovers, you need to look down the field more. The week before, they really didn't need him as they were leading the Cowboys for a decent amount of that game. So I like the script here for Bell. I like the matchup overall, and definitely more than Nick Chubb. So yeah, I would take that, especially in the PPR format.
As we go into the FanDuel ownership, I must say the first 4 guys were 4 of the 5 or 6 guys that we just talked about in Fournette, Carson, Hopkins, and Thomas. But then there's 2 more guys that maybe we can talk about that are 22.8% and 22.3%, respectively, is Saquon Barkley. Going in against the matchup that we just discussed at Detroit, 22.4% Sal. He's 8,600. Last week did leave the game, came back, was nursing still that high ankle sprain. But I mean, let's talk about this. He is someone who I was hoping that would be down in ownership this week, because right now, you would just be hoping to have the offense just be more around him, centered around him. yeah, 18 carries is great, but where he excelled last year that really caught our eye was the passing game for one, but then these big plays that just really increased the value of Saquon, of how explosive he was. So I want to ask you, I mean, with Saquon this week, is he a GBP play?
Yeah, Saquon's a GBP play, I think. And yeah, when you're looking at FanDuel, you can see the ownership numbers there being definitely a little bit different because of just the site. And he's $1,000 difference from a guy like Christian McCaffrey on the top end. I think Saquon's fine at that price point. I think I prefer Saquon. Honestly, if you can get up to it for $600 more than Chris Carson, who's a little bit higher owns, definitely prefer Fournette, and that's the ownership is as well. Yeah, I think it's an okay spot for Saquon here in GPPs, and I probably like the ownership. Maybe have a little bit more on FanDuel with that pricing. When you look at it on DraftKings, yeah, guys like Saquon and McCaffrey, just not getting any love this week on sites like DraftKings because of their price points, but they can pay off those price tags very easily. And if people aren't going to own them, I'm just kind of shifting my lineups around, getting to one of those top end running backs this week, which just is naturally going to make it a bit different.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that this week for me, with the level of talent at the running back position, I think I'm going to cycle through these top 4 or 5 guys with these price points of over 7,500. And I think that for me, having that kind of even spread and differentiating myself will be key. I don't want to be too concentrated on any of these top tier running backs. I do feel like a lot of these guys are in great matchups, but for me personally, I think also I'm looking elsewhere as well. So the rotation is going to be what's key when it comes to rostering. Maybe say Saquon Barkley. Next guy, Tyler Lockett, going into a really good matchup in a defensive secondary that is one of the worst in the league, Sal. And for Lockett in this passing offense of Seattle, Russell Wilson has had an outstanding year up until last week through his first pick, but I don't think that takes away from what kind of year he's having thus far. He's coming in at 22.8% for Tyler Lockett on FanDuel. He's always seems to be one of these guys as far as the wide receiver position that has been showing up constantly. And the only thing that concerns me with Lockett is, early on in the season, he was getting heavy target production, but now his targets have significantly decreased. And I want to ask you, even though he's still producing to some extent, getting 5 catches for a touchdown and still, finding the end zone, I guess you could say, over the last few weeks where he scored 2 touchdowns the last 3 games. He's got 3 red zone targets last week, and then 2 before that the last 2 weeks combined. So he's 5 targets in the red zone the last 3 weeks. But I want to ask you, when you go from 10 receptions to 11 receptions down to 4, 4, 5, 5, and having the target significantly decreased, does that make you weary in any way, or is this still just what? Don't mind that. Continue to keep pushing with Tyler Lockett.
No, I think it has to make you weary when his price tag comes up. I think it definitely does because that this team is very and as a favorite on the road, especially if Matt Ryan doesn't play, then I just washed Tyler Lockett on a lot of my lineups. But as a favorite going into this game on the road, it's a spot where it can very easily just become Chris Carson 25 touch game or a little bit more. And more times than not, you don't see Russell Wilson throw for more than 30 times. That's what this team wants to do. They want to keep him in the 28 to 32 pass attempt range. And yeah, that does limit the upside of Tyler Lockett. He's not going to have double-digit targets in those types of games. Now, this game can turn into a shootout if Matt Ryan's healthy, a bad defense, a suspect secondary for Seattle. So I think there is upside here, but I'm not getting to as much of Tyler Lockett, not at that high of a clip. I think it's fine. It's not too high, but I probably come in somewhere, and I'm not getting to a lot of Seattle stacks in general, so that's probably why. So I just like other options on both sites in the 7K range. I honestly like an unowned at this point, Mike Evans, a little bit more when you factor in the ownerships around them. I think Brandon Cooks is a decent option as a pivot on FanDuel at a similar price range when you're talking GPPs. So yeah, Tyler Lockett's the one guy that I probably don't have as much or have like the strongest stance against. And it's not his play. It's just that the game script when Seattle's a favorite and leading is more times than not run more than Russell Wilson passes. And if you just follow that trend, it's really tough for Tyler Lockett to get there. Now, the matchup's fantastic. You can play him if you want. It's not crazy ownership. I'll probably just side with coming in a little bit under it.
So as we know, Tyler Lockett runs the slot primarily. He's ran 346 routes this year in the slot compared to 92 on the outside. And why I'm mentioning this is because over I think the last 4 or 5 weeks, the Atlanta Falcons defense to slot wide receivers, 0 touchdowns, Sal, 9 fantasy points per game, only 51.5 yards per game. But on the outside, you look at a defensive unit in the secondary that's given up 4 touchdowns, second most in the league, 22.6 points, fantasy points per game, second most, and 100.5 yards per game, which is by far the most of any team in the NFL. And so this is going to be my question to you is how do you feel about a pivot to DK Metcalf where kind of a boomer bust play. However, though, with the recent struggles in the Atlanta secondary, knowing that this could be a guy that we could attack, got 9 targets last week against the Ravens. Any love for maybe a pivot to DK Metcalf with the opposite guy here in this passing game with the Seahawks?
Yeah, I do have some interest in DK Metcalf. There's just a lot of value wide receivers that you can get to, so it's not like he's popping free. I prefer Kenny Stills. I probably prefer a couple other guys down there, Corey Davis. But it'll be a positive matchup for him. It's sort of the similar and echoed concerns under this entire passing offense. If they only throw 28 times, everybody sort of has a ceiling that's a little bit lower than some of these other games. But yeah, DK's fine. He'll get Kendall Sheffield, maybe probably if indeed Trufant won't be in and on him. If Trufant's in, it's fine. Trufant's given up 5 touchdowns through 5 games. So yeah, it's a good matchup for DK Metcalf. You can get exposure to him and feel good about it on a slate where there's a ton of value wide receivers that have good matchups. He'll be one of the 6 or 7 guys I rotate through and would probably come in around the middle of the ownership I get on those guys as opposed to being overweight on it.
Yeah, I think what we'll see is we'll either see Kendall Sheffield or maybe DeMonte Casey, both who have yet to give up a touchdown this year. And the majority of the time they're in the slot. So going to be pretty interesting with this matchup and seeing how much ownership is actually gravitating to Tyler Lockett at this point. But could be one of those situations where I just don't know if I want to pay up for him, to be honest with you. I feel like there's better areas where we can save money and maybe get more production out of some matchups that we'll talk about. You guys, before we go into this second half of the show and break down the actual main slate and go game by game, Sal and I, just know if you guys haven't used Osmo.com yet, any of the tools and resources, we talk about the ownership projections, we talk about all the different tools and resources, all the articles, everything behind the paywall, guys. There's a lot of things in the NFL section as well that you can look at when it comes to, showdown rankings or top stack tools, or just looking at any type of projection possible. If you're looking to sign up, you can go to any of the pages in the NFL section, look at the videos, watch and see what you're actually getting before you get involved. But you can get 50% off your first month to try. And as you know, you're teaming up with the #1 DFS player in the world himself, Alex Osmo Baker. And the code is going to be NFL Strategy. So if you're looking to sign up and save 50% off your first month, use the code NFL Strategy. Try it out for a month. Don't forget, every sport is almost available here. NBA, NHL, PGA, NASCAR, soccer, MMA. I mean, even everything for betting, tennis, college football, you name it. So guys, don't forget the code NFL Strategy. That's NFL STRATGEY. All right, guys. I think I spelled that wrong, actually. Wow. That was an epic fail. Was it, Sal?
I wasn't paying fully attention to the spelling, so we can just go with you're good on it. We can go with you're good on it.
All right, man. So here we go. First game. Let's break it down and talk about it. We're going to be looking at the Denver Broncos at the Indianapolis Colts. Sal, 42.5 over under currently, 5.5 point favorites for the Colts at home. Where are we going here, man? I got to tell you, Joe Flacco looks absolutely horrible. Looks completely lost as a quarterback, cannot read defenses. He just looks just not good whatsoever in the pocket, very uncomfortable here. Are you going anywhere in this game on either side of the ball?
I don't really have any strong takes here. I think that Emmanuel Sanders being shipped out, people are overreacting to Deshaun Hamilton's role being bigger or different. Like Deshaun Hamilton's been the primary slot wide receiver all season. Sanders has been on the outside. Hamilton is continuing and will continue to be the slot receiver with guys like Fred Brown on the outside and Sims. So nothing really changes all that much for Hamilton. No interest there. Sutton, I'll have low exposure to. I think he's in an okay spot, but the issue is Indy plays a really tough zone defense. Like their cornerbacks are not good in man coverage, and that's a reason why they don't play man coverage, but they play a very disciplined and productive zone defense, which will limit big plays. And he's 5,300, so it's a fine price point. There's guys who are cheaper that I like more. Running backs, they're just in an even split. You have right now Lindsey out touching Freeman per game, 2.1 touches per game, but Freeman's playing more snaps, seeing just as many targets. It's just not a spot that I want to be paying for a split even running back by committee. So nothing on Denver for me outside of very small doses of Cortland Sutton. And then, yeah, on Indy, T.Y. Hilton, I think he's still a decent price point, but Chris Harris Jr. was raving in the media like 3 or 4 days ago how he's hoping he doesn't get traded because he wants to shadow T.Y. Hilton. In 2 shadow matchups this year, Chris Harris Jr., Allen Robinson, 2 catches, 13 yards, Devontae Adams, 2 catches, 36 yards. And not a lot of people shut down Devontae Adams. He got shut down by Harris, who is no longer a slot cornerback, playing primarily on the outside. He'll follow T.Y., no interest there. Marlon Mack kind of gets lost for me. It's a Denver defense, a run defense that right now on Pro Football Focus is ranked number 1. It's a Denver run defense that surely got exploited by Leonard Fournette when they were banged up and injured. But outside of that, has been very productive. Marlon Mack sees somewhat of a pass catching role, 2 to 3 catches maybe you get from him. But it's not a spot that I'm prioritizing him. I would prefer a guy that I don't even have that much interest in Chase Edmonds over him. Marlon Mack's just down my list as like a 10th running back I have interest in. So yeah, this game in general, a wash outside of some exposure, very little amounts of Cortland Sutton.
I must say, man, this defensive unit from the pass defense of the Broncos, they're very stingy, and we've talked about this before. They hadn't had given up a touchdown any cornerback this season up until last week. Chris Harris gave up one to Tyreek Hill. I think it was a blown coverage though, from what I saw in that matchup. But I mean, outside of that, they don't give up scores, and I think this is a tough test for Jacoby Brissett and the passing offense. And I think this is why I want to talk about Marlon Mack. I think Mack at his price point, he's 6,100 on DraftKings, Sal. He's not projected to be highly owned, sub 10%. But the thing is, he's a workhorse. We've seen multiple times this year where he's gotten over 20 attempts. He's involved in the passing game. I think 4 or 5 games this year, he's gotten 3 targets, 3 catches. But the thing is with this, I know the Broncos rush D is good. And I know people will say, well, what do you think in the rush D is good? You're absolutely right. But there have been moments this year where we've seen the Broncos rush D have some vulnerability. And I think the way that the Colts win this game, knowing that they're 5.5-point favorites, is they're going to have to control the line of scrimmage. I feel like they're going to have to move the chains through the running game. I don't necessarily think they can beat the Broncos through the passing game. I think they're going to have to rely heavily on Mack. And I think we see more production out of Mack this week than we have maybe in some games this year because of this game plan and how they can actually beat this defense. So I really think Mack is a strong play at the running back position. Just want to get your take and see if you feel the same way, or if maybe it's just not worth it.
I guess it's interesting because there's moving pieces. So right now I don't have much interest in Mack, but that's what my expectations that and probably these are my personal expectations that Latavius Murray will start with no Alvin Kamara. So if Murray starts, I just probably don't get too much Mack in that range. If Kamara is in and there's no Murray in that pricing range, it really just comes down to you having Marlon Mack and you having a guy like Josh Jacobs who hasn't practiced all week with an injured shoulder. So then, yeah, if you're hovering around in the 6K range and Alvin Kamara is starting this week, then Mack probably almost like by default becomes the best option in that range, and I'll have some exposure based on certain lineup constructions. But if Latavius Murray plays, it's just going to suck up a lot of that ownership in that range for me.
Just to give you an idea, Sal, this season for the Denver defense to the running back position, out of 6 games, they've given over, in 3 of those games, 29.6 points, 41.4 points, and 32.9 points to the running back position. And they also struggled in week 1 against the Raiders, 25.4 points as well. So on paper, it might look like their defensive unit is pretty stout when it comes to the rushing game, but they have been giving up fantasy points to the running back position in unique ways. So it could be interesting, but I think Marlon Mack here is probably my only play from the Saints side. I think I agree with you when it comes to the passing game of the Colts. I just don't see anyone there that really I get excited about. And outside of that, I want to ask you, Colts defense, are they in play?
Colts defense, yeah, I think they're okay here. I mean, we know Joe Flacco has looked pretty lost the last couple of weeks. You lose Emmanuel Sanders, and you put in Fred Brown for that. That's going to be an offensive drop down. So I think they're in play, yeah, especially when they're a favorable or at least somewhat favorable price point, definitely.
Next game, Seattle at Atlanta. Atlanta 7-point dogs to the Seahawks. Falcons, as we know, one of the worst defenses when it comes to the passing game. We talked about Chris Carson, man, and this running game as him being one of the highest projected players on this week, according to Osmos projections. But where I really want to get your take, Sal, is I want to get your take on this Falcons passing game with now Sanu in New England. Calvin Ridley now, is the next man up, obviously, very talented wideout. And I want to get your take as well on the Seattle passing game outside of who we talked about. I want to talk about Russell Wilson. So we'd love to hear you break down both of these guys.
Yeah, so with the expectation that Matt Ryan plays and he's going to be healthy, and that's what I'm going to do right now, is that I really like this attack. I think it'll be a top 2 stack that I have. I think it's undervalued in terms of ownership and just cost. So I like Matt Ryan this week. if he is healthy, definitely. And then, yeah, so you have Mohamed Sanu shipped out, a guy who's been a slot wide receiver for them and just like an unorthodox slot wide receiver, sort of like Chris Godwin, just a really big bodied slot wide receiver that for the most part should probably be used on the outside. So what this leaves is a void in slot wide receivers. You have Julio Jones will probably be on the outside. And then I would expect, and we don't really know until the games start, but I would expect Calvin Ridley to be on the outside for part of the game, Justin Hardy in the slot, and 3 wide receiver sets. And then on the other part of the game, you'll have Julio on the outside still, Russell Gage on the other outside, and then in the slot, they move some Calvin Ridley. Ridley's played the second most snaps on the team out of the slot, but that's not a lot because it's just been dominated by Sanu. But I think the thing that's going to get a little bit over noticed here is that it's still the 3 primary pass catchers are Julio, Ridley, and Hooper. Just kind of breaking down where they are on the field moving forward will be somewhat important. But I think Hooper sees a huge boost in the middle of the field with 233 slot snaps now gone from Sanu. So yeah, in this passing attack, I favor it so far this week in stacks. I'm getting to Matt Ryan, Julio, and Austin Hooper. I think Austin Hooper is a very solid play at tight end, the top 2 play this week. And then when you just factor in Julio Jones not having a ton of ownership, when I get to him, it's probably primarily in these stacks. And I think it works out nicely because of all the value we have that you can fit Julio and not have to worry about it being a bit constrained.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would like to see Matt Ryan in this matchup just because I do feel like they'll play from behind like they did last week. And I think that that's just going to really force a lot from the passing game. But I mean, outside of that, we've seen Seattle's defense kind of struggle in some aspects when it comes to the wide receiver position. The Rams kind of torched them in their secondary. The Browns did as well. I mean, if you remember the first game of the season, Cincinnati Bengals went off for a combined 63 fantasy points amongst all their wide receivers against them. So there are some plays here when it comes to Julio and Ridley that are appealing because of those vulnerable spots in the secondary. But I will say this: when it comes to Hooper, I was looking it up and really seeing kind of how this defensive unit has been against tight ends, and I must say they've done a great job a majority of the season so far. Sal, the Seattle defense against the tight end position. Last week we saw Mark Andrews, even though he did drop a couple touchdown passes and could have had a real high upside game, they limited him in more than one fashion. And then what we've seen outside of that Rams game where Gerald Everett went off, there hasn't been much production. So I will say this though, if Matt Schaub plays, I would be interested in Hooper a lot more just because I feel like there's going to be a security blanket there. And we saw that last week. Hooper was shut down the entire game until he had no catches until Schaub came in. And then after that, Hooper produced. I think he had 4 catches. He had a touchdown. And, not taking anything away from the talent level of Hooper. I think no matter what, I think he can produce. But I think from what we've seen on the Seattle side, there hasn't been any really big explosive tight end games outside of Gerald Everett. So just one thing to take in consideration.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think we'll probably end up differing there a little bit, but yeah. So I think Everett went off, and then you had Mark Andrews dropping a touchdown last week really burned me a lot, and put me on a little bit of a tilt. But yeah, outside of that, they haven't just faced a lot of higher caliber tight ends, and I would say that Hooper is definitely in that range. And just for me at the price tag, it fits well. I think this week, if he'll face primarily guys who have struggled against tight ends in coverage, Tedrick Thompson's been he's been the guy who got torn up by Gerald Everett, a couple times by Mark Andrews. So if I weight that a little bit, and then also just the positionality of tight end this week, I'll probably get to Hooper. In these stacks, definitely will be one of my top 2 options with Julio, with Atlanta stacks and even game stacks running it back with. But then just in terms of tight end ownership, he would be a top 2 option, probably with Darren Waller for me.
Hooper's second highest projected tight end owned this week at 13.4% on DraftKings right now, and similar ownership projection on FanDuel as well. Next game, Arizona Cardinals at the New Orleans Saints, over under 48. Saints becoming a bigger dog by the day, minus 10.5 now. I must say, Sal, I'm done talking about the Arizona Cardinals. I have nothing to say about them. I spoke about it yesterday with Manny. Cliff Kingsbury, just not a fan, especially after what he did to me last week with his whole David Johnson nonsense. So I'm a little salty there. I was talking to Sal before the show for everyone that's in here. My main lineup last week in tournaments across the board had 200.5 points, I believe, or 201 points with David Johnson. So a lot of opportunity missed there for me. Really appreciate it to the Cardinals organization for screwing me over. But we've talked about this team a lot, Sal. Especially Larry Fitzgerald over the last few weeks. Great matchups. Got to play him. He played the Giants, the Falcons, and Bengals. Nothing. He had 6 catches in 2 of those games. but he had just one catch against a Giants defense that we love to exploit in the secondary. So now it's a tough matchup. I mean, we gotta admit here, this Saints defense is pretty stout. They're pretty firm up front and that front four, and also in coverage when it comes to the passing game. So, is there any love for any Arizona Cardinal here?
Yeah, no, I'm not coming in that much. We'll see what happens with David Johnson. Obviously, if David Johnson's out, Chase Edmonds becomes at least in play, but it's a really brutal matchup for him against the Saints. You're kind of relying on Chase Edmonds to get some and a decent amount of pass catching work, which he can, but at the price point, I think there's other options. Yeah, it comes down for this offense really as a whole. And either way, I probably don't get to much. But Christian Kirk not playing the last 3.5 weeks or so has really impacted how they want to just play. They were playing a ton of 4 wide receiver sets. Kirk and Fitzgerald were on the field 82+% of the time, with Fitz being out there over 90% of the time in the slot. They were running a ton of 4 wide receiver sets. They were running a ton of 3 wide receiver sets. Last 2 weeks, Fitzgerald only seeing 74% of the snaps each of the last 2 weeks. So what that tells you is that they're just running a lot less 11 personnel, a lot less 4 wide receiver sets, and they're going to 2 wide receivers on the outside. And last week was just very heavily skewed because they just kept running the ball nonstop. So I think that is a spot where if Christian Kirk plays, it actually boosts the entire offense, in my opinion, and it makes Larry Fitzgerald a better play with Kirk out there, even if it might mean some volume goes away. But in general, if Kirk does play, I'll have some interest in him. He doesn't get the greatest depth of targets, so guys like Corey Davis in that price range, I'll like more. Kenny Stills. So yeah, it becomes almost a complete wash. If Kirk is out, I'm not going to get to any of these guys. If he's in, I'll have some exposure to Christian Kirk.
The New Orleans Saints obviously are still in this trying to figure out what's up with Alvin Kamara and Latavius Murray. And the thing is this: the Saints go into a bye week next week. There's also noise that maybe Drew Brees returns, but given the matchup and given that I think that this is a easier matchup than some would probably say, or what it's showing here by Vegas totals, I will say this: do you think it's smart for the Saints to maybe hold off on Kamara and Brees and just wait for them to come back fully healthy after the bye week?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think that's definitely going to happen with Drew Brees if I had to just make an assumption right now to go off of. And my assumptions are that Kamara will be the same thing. So, like Kamara, it just makes sense. I mean, if indeed he's dealing with some sort of ankle sprain or a high ankle sprain, it would make sense to hold him out just for the longevity of his health on this season for this team. But then also going into the bye week, that bye week would be about a month since he sustained the injury. And that's about how long it takes 4 to 6 weeks most running backs to heal from some sort of ankle injury. So I think they're kind of holding him out and saying he's been a limited practice participant, even though beat writers are saying he's just been like stretching and walking and jogging. I think that what that's going to lead to is just trying to get some sort of deception in terms of game planning against you, have the defense have to practice all week against Kamara and Murray. And it's just something that'll take a little bit extra work for them in preparation. But I do think both these guys will be out come Sunday. But again, just keep an eye on it.
Yeah, the Arizona defense, when it comes to the running back position, has given up at least 15 points to the running back spot in every single game this season. And to go into even further detail, they've given up over at least 25 points in 3 of those 7 games. So I think Latavius Murray, what we saw this past week, really got the best of this Chicago defense, man. I mean, the missed tackles, just the explosiveness as far as the power that Murray was bringing. It's really hard to kind of discredit him and just say that it was a 1-game thing. I think that he does have talent. I think that when he's called upon, he's able to produce. So regardless of who's here in this matchup, I think, Murray or Kamara is definitely in play. And we spoke about Mike Thomas, 8 catches in every single game this season. The Saints game plan is pretty simple. We spoke about it earlier: run and pass to Mike Thomas. So from a volume and production standpoint, it's hard to ignore Mike Thomas. And I think that's why he's one of the highest players on this week. But outside of that, the Saints defense, I wanted to ask you, Sal, could you go and roster the Saints defense this week against Kyle Murray?
Yeah, I think you can. I think this team, if Christian Kirk's in there, will throw it a little bit more than usual, which will just lead to more opportunities. We've seen, at least earlier in the season, Kyler Murray kind of had some happy feet. So that's the only downside is he can turn the ball over, but he can also evade a lot of possible, fumble sixes or just sacks because of his legs. And he'll just turn that into positive plays. So I think there's probably other spots that I look towards. But if you have David Johnson out, you have Christian Kirk out, that's an obvious bump down for the offense. If you want to roster the defense, I can't kind of argue with you too much when 2 of their top players are going to be out, if they are out.
I want to mention one more thing in this game, Sal. Jared Cook might be out. Josh Hill could be the main target this week, going against the worst defense when it comes to the tight end position and coverage in the Arizona Cardinals. Surprisingly, they shut down Evan Ingram last week. I don't know what that was all about. Supposedly he was having a lot of emotional issues, or he was just getting in his head. He just was acting crazy. But I want to ask you, when it comes to this matchup, any love for Josh Hill in the tight end spot if Jared Cook is out?
I think that you could have made a case for it. I'm not going to get to it. I just think that we kind of have a separation now, and we saw it with Darren Waller last week, but really all season long, like the Darren Wallers, the Austin Hoopers, and then you're just Zach Ertz and Evan Ingram, those types of players. Like the ceiling to these guys is much higher than a Josh Hill. Like what Josh Hill did last week, having somewhere around 10 to 12 fantasy points, that's more times than not what this guy's ceiling is going to be. So I'm just going to pay an extra $2,000 to get the Hoopers and the Wallers, whose floors are probably what Josh Hill's ceiling is most weeks. And now when you also open up that OJ Howard's out and you're going to have Cameron Brate step in on this slate for cheaper, if I'm going to punt tight end, I'll just punt all the way down to Cameron Brate. So I probably won't have any exposure to Hill.
Josh Hill last week, 53 of 78 snaps, Sal, 3 targets, 3 catches, 43 yards, and a touchdown. So, one thing to take note that maybe he can produce, but there's other guys there at the tight end position that we're going to speak about in some other games. I just don't mind it, but this is the worst tight end defensive coverage unit in the league at this point. And if there's areas to expose it at cheap price points, just something to take notice if you're multi-entering in GBPs, guys. Next game, Chargers at Chicago Bears. Bears 4-point favorites, 3.5 actually, from what I'm seeing in the update, over under 41. I got to be honest with you here, Sal. I'm not really seeing too much, but then I thought to myself, could you target a defense that's been weak and vulnerable the last 2 weeks? But then I also look at the Chargers and they confuse me greatly. And I say this because since Melvin Gordon has returned, it's changed the complete identity of this offense in ways where Keenan Allen has seemed to lose production. Austin Eckler now is just this backup guy to Melvin Gordon, who hasn't produced much, fumbled at the goal line last week. But Los Angeles doesn't even have an opportunity to win that game if it wasn't for Eckler in that fourth quarter. He seems to be still producing in a smaller role. And I want to ask you, could Eckler be a sneak play this week, considering the production that he gives, knowing that he still has a small role with Melvin Gordon here still in the mix?
Yeah, I think I like Eckler here. It's really like if you get no Latavius Murray opening up, so then in that pricing range, I like Eckler and then a little bit of Marlon Mack. I do think that so Eckler still remains on the field. He'll continue to remain on the field, especially when Gordon is just literally fumbling games away last week. So I do like Eckler a little bit. It's no sort of priority. Keenan Allen, I had interest in Keenan Allen once again this week, as I did last week. He had a good first half for 4 catches, 61 yards, then gets shut down in the second half. I would have had interest again this week, but it came out, I believe, last night or yesterday that he's going to be on a snap count. If he suits up, he should be active, but on a snap count and limited. So we'll see if they stick to that, but I just can't, with that information, go through with playing him. So no real interest there. It does boost up Mike Williams a little bit, who already was underpriced coming into the week. Again, there's a ton of guys down in that price range. Mohamed Sanu is the exact same price as Mike Williams, and I tend to kind of lean to get to Mohamed Sanu in a new role where there's no Josh Gordon, Julian Edelman's banged up. But we'll see how that plays out. I think you can get to Mike Williams and have some confidence in GPPs. Probably don't get there in cash. I think the biggest beneficiaries of a limited Keenan Allen and the poor play of Melvin Gordon are definitely Austin Eckler, short passing game, and Hunter Henry, who continues to be a favorable price point on DraftKings. But that all being said, I'll probably see the most exposure and not much of it to Austin Eckler, and that's only if Latavius Murray is out. On the Chicago side of the ball, I don't really want to play too much Allen Robinson this week. Casey Hayward should be seeing him. Allen Robinson will go into the slot to avoid that, but I don't think it'll be enough to outscore other 6K range wide receivers. I do think it's a really interesting spot for a guy like David Montgomery, who I'm going to have shares of, and it doesn't mean a lot. He's going to be like 2% owned, so you could double the field very easily. It's 4% owned and have no leverage in your lineups against you and only have positive leverage there. So the Bears have been saying that they want to run the ball this week, and they probably should because Mitch Trubisky looked terrible. They only ran the ball 5 times total last week, 2 for David Montgomery. If David Montgomery at 4,400 gets you 15 points, that can win you a milli maker. I know that on average you want 20 points or so, but that is enough to get you there. We saw James White at like 13 points win it a couple weeks ago. So Montgomery's not a huge play. It's a milli maker type of play where I'll have probably double the field just to have some sort of leverage. That's like 4%. It's a week where the Chargers defensive line, I think, is banged up. I believe they have 2 players out on the defensive line this week and potentially 3 if Melvin Ingram doesn't return as a linebacker. So it's not a great overall spot for him, but it's just kind of a spot that I'll just play it in milli makers, but nothing else on Chicago.
I think the Bears are horrible offensively. I think Trubisky is lost and confused. Outside of Allen Robinson, and the poor guy, such a talented wideout, has not had a great quarterback to start his NFL career yet, but still produces. And I can only imagine if he had a top tier quarterback, throwing to him, the amount of production that he would give even more. But I mean, this Chicago defense, if you look at it and what it's given up in production, I'm going to tell you, Saints 40.8 points to the running back position as far as fantasy points. The Raiders 50.4 fantasy points allowed, DK points. Minnesota Vikings 28.70 points to the running back position. It gets better, Sal. To the Washington Redskins, they gave up 53.7 points to the wide opposition. To the Broncos, 40.3 points to the wide opposition. You mean to tell me that the two of the worst offenses in the NFL were able to produce that many points from that position against a defense that people really spoke highly about? I got to say, the reason why I'm breaking this down is because I think one guy that we need to focus on here is Mike Williams. I think Mike Williams is in a great spot. If Keenan Allen doesn't play, regardless if he plays or not, Mike Williams has been getting the target share. The only thing that bothers me with him is that he hasn't found the red zone yet. And I think that he's getting the targets in the red zone. He just hasn't came down with the ball to score. 5 red zone targets the last 3 games. But I mean, he's gotten over the last 3 games as well, 29 targets. So when you look at this passing game, the ball's got to go somewhere. And I think Mike Williams is definitely someone in play, 4,000 on DraftKings. And I think that people are thinking, and this is why I love to target this game in this situation, and call me crazy, Sal, but we've seen games over the last few weeks. Oh, it's going to be a defensive battle. No one's going to score. It's going to be horrible offensive production. It's been the complete opposite. And I think this is one of those trick games where we really put too much emphasis on this over-under. But I got to tell you, this is 2 weak defenses. And I do like your call on Montgomery if he's able to produce at that price point. San Diego, or excuse me, I don't know why I keep saying San Diego. Los Angeles has struggled against running backs. So I like that call. But I think you got to take note, too, that this is a game that 2 defenses that have struggled significantly, you got to attack while the iron's hot. If they're still struggling, I haven't seen anything to make me believe that anything's changed yet. So I don't know. That's just me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And yeah, I think that Mike Williams just fits that GPP mold a ton. It's probably, and honestly, if Keenan Allen's not in there, we've seen games, especially against Pittsburgh, where Mike Williams will show somewhat of a floor that he can catch 5 or 6 balls for somewhere in the 80s, so he doesn't just ruin your lineups if it's not his boom game. But yeah, he has been very much due for some touchdown regression, and this could be a pretty good week for that. This secondary and this Bears defense overall is still quality, dealing with injuries and just on the field way too much because of how bad the offense has been. But the number 1 ranked defense, it regresses on average 7 spots when you go into the next season, and it seems like the Bears are going to regress a lot more than that. So yeah, it seems like a good spot. Mike Williams is the main piece, probably from the Chargers, that stands out for GPPs, and then David Montgomery from the Bears. But that being said, David Montgomery is like if you're playing 50 lineups, you probably have him in like 2 to 3, and you feel good about that.
No, you're absolutely, Sal. I don't know if you read the chat, man, but some of these comments are just funny. I don't know if you're taking note of it. And for anyone in here, before we go into this next game, please like this. There's 320 of you guys in here right now. Would love to support. Sal and I, we continue to produce this content every Saturday, but also everyone here at Osmo, just continuing with the live content every single hour, it seems like now, with live shows. If you can, just give us a thumbs up, subscribe, continue to support and like this page, guys. We really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to watch us and to try to get better for next week, week in and week out, guys. So thank you very much. All right, next game, Sal. Cincinnati Bengals at the Rams in London. Rams 13-point favorites, over under 48. We spoke a lot about this game already, but the boss man Alex said Andy Dalton yesterday in the On the Contrary show. I gotta disagree. I don't know, man. This Rams defense now, and tell me if you agree with me, Sal, is pretty different with Jalen Ramsey. And people say, well, how can you say that? Well, the previous weeks before last week against the Falcons, they played a lot of zone. They were not on the ball as far as man-to-man coverage tight up front, and it created a lot of space for these wideouts. I think they have a lot more confidence in Ramsey now to be able to blitz more, to apply that man-to-man coverage, less zone, and getting to the quarterback faster, which is why I think they succeeded so much last week against the Falcons, Sal. And this week, I don't expect them to change things up. I expect them to do more, actually. Andy Dalton last week, and on 4 consecutive throws, threw 3 interceptions of those 4 throws because of the pressure that the Jaguars were putting on him. He's now going to get the front line with Donald in there and this coverage of the Rams. And I just want to ask you, I mean, is Andy Dalton in any type of way, shape, or form worth considering rostering?
Yeah, so Andy Dalton, I'm probably not going to get to. I understand sort of the Rams have been really suspect in certain weeks, and yeah, outside of Ramsey, like they're going to be pretty suspect on the other side with Troy Hill as a cornerback. The safety's banged up. Robbie Coleman in the slot has been good, though. Yeah, I'm not going to get to the Dalton side of it. Erickson is like a cash type of play at 3,700. I think you can do better. I think A.J. Brown, who's not your stereotypical cash play, but he's seeing targets and has more upside. I honestly probably feel more comfortable going there. No interest in Joe Mixon or any of these running backs. I think the big thing is that the Bengals offensive line, which has been terrible, might be getting healthier this week. We'll see. So Cordy Glenn was suspended, $200,000 and suspended for conduct detrimental to the team last week. He's one of their tackles. He should be back. Michael Jordan, one of their guards, he's questionable for this week. They might have 3 offensive linemen back this week, which will surely help them and really shift a lot of things. So guys like a very cheap Joe Mixon, I don't have interest this week, but I think it's interesting for GPPs when your line gets healthier. Tyler Boyd's cheap enough for me to get there. He moves into the slot enough to avoid a guy like Jalen Ramsey. Jalen Ramsey won't move into the slot all that much, but when Boyd's out of the slot for about a third of this game or so, yeah, he probably sees Jalen Ramsey. So that's not great, but there's upside at 5,100 for him to do enough damage to get there. No real interest in Auden Tate on the outside. Yeah, Cincinnati side is really just small doses of Tyler Boyd. And then when I get to the Rams side, yeah, I do like the Rams side. I like Todd Gurley a lot. He's one of my favorite running backs on the slate at his price tag, almost a 2-touchdown favorite, 13-point favorite, technically at home, but he's in London this week. And yeah, he faces the Bengals that are bottoming. I mean, most rushing yards given up, most fantasy points, second worst in terms of how many yardage and receiving touchdowns. And now you get Gurley, who sure, like people are worried about him and maybe the price tag's a little high because of his leg injury, but this is a guy who played 61% of the snaps and still saw a 19-touch week. If I get 19 touches this week out of Todd Gurley at 7,400, I'm feeling really good about that. And now you have another week to get healthier. So I like Todd Gurley the most. You can get to the Rams passing game and feel comfortable about it, but a 13-point favorite more times than not in the second half leads to a team I'm just running the ball a little bit more. No real interest in Darrell Henderson. I know people will say, oh, you might see 8 to 10 touches. You need a lot of good things to happen for him there in terms of like 2 40-plus yard runs and a touchdown for that to pay off in a GPP.
Before the show, Sal and I talked about Todd Gurley because I really have interest in him in this week. And Sal made some great points. I mean, Cincinnati defensively against the running game is statistically the worst in almost every category in the NFL. Very weak against the run. And we've seen so many offensives just run all over them. And there was one, silver lining to Todd Gurley this past week where, Sal mentioned it. He had the most carries that he's had of the season so far at 18 attempts. And the thing is this, though, I've been really anti-Gurley because of how much I've rostered him this year in some games. But then when I look at the game last week against the Falcons, what I noticed the most, and that's played a trend, is the offensive line has prevented Gurley from really giving us the potential that we could see. And then I started really diving into it. The offensive line was rated the best last year, according to PFF. This year, it's one of the worst, a complete opposite. And what we've seen is an offensive line that has really just broken down right at the line of scrimmage. And we've seen defenses stop a lot of the running game or a lot of running attempts in the backfield, not giving any holes, not giving any opportunity to see Gurley thrive. And so that's what's been frustrating the most. I think where they've seen the most success is when they run these little sweeps to the outside and, he's able to create some space for himself. But outside of that, I feel like that's been the area of weakness and why we really haven't seen the production of Gurley to the fullest extent. But coming into this week, I think that, given the fact that it's a must-win game for them, they're big favorites on essentially it's on the road. I mean, they're in London. But, if he's going to get that attempt threshold that Sal spoke about, I got to go with that. And I mean, if he can get involved in the passing game as well, he caught a touchdown pass last week. I think there's a lot of upside there. It's a great matchup for him. And if they run this offense around him as well, I could really see him getting into the end zone. So I don't mind it what bit. And then I think the wide receivers are in place, Sal. I think that's a great point. This air game is going to, I think, completely destroy the Bengals. So I think anyone is in play, from Everett to Kupp to Cooks to Woods. And I think pairing that with Goff is a great play. On the opposite side, Sal, with Tate and Boyd, how frustrating has Tyler Boyd been these last few weeks where he gets so many targets, but the production isn't there? And so I want to ask you as we close out this game, is it fair to stack the Rams and run it back with Tate, Erickson, or Boyd as that secondary wide receiver? Or do we really see any production coming from these wideouts from the Bengals?
Yeah, I think I would stack Boyd just because that price point is just dropping off of a cliff right now. He's had like a 3-week stretch of some poor games. Actually, really just 2 weeks. He had a pretty big game a couple weeks back, but we know what that guy's upside is, and he should be able to avoid, for the far majority of the game, a guy like Jalen Ramsey. So I think he's viable there. And then, yeah, just kind of to close it out on the Rams offense, I prefer Cooks the most, and usually I prefer Kupp the most, even at his price tag. But I'm going to take Cooks the most this week. This Bengals secondary, not only is like their offensive line injured and their defensive line, but their secondary is so banged up. I mean, their two top cornerbacks were both out last week for the first week, looked real bad. They're both going to be out this week as well. Brandon Cooks is going to get to go up against Tony McRae, who's given up for the majority of the game, not the whole game, won't be a shadow, but who's given up 11 catches on only 13 targets in limited snaps, 129 yards and a touchdown, 134 passer rating against. You have Brandon Cooks at home. That's where he's by far the best in his career. Very wide splits in terms of where he scores his touchdowns. So I prefer Cooks the most in the passing game. And then, yeah, I'll probably have top 3 exposure at running back to Todd Gurley this week. And then at home, I should actually clarify because I keep saying this, but I know they're in London. So that's technically on the road. So I guess we can watch that one.
I mean, does that play a role, or I mean, is that just something that people like to kind of troll when it comes to the London games? Because I'll tell you, historically, London games seem to have production, at least from one side of the ball. So, and looking at this game, it's just so lopsided that it's hard to say the Rams just don't dominate here.
Yeah, I think that for quarterbacks, it probably affects them a little bit, these London games, but I don't like change any of my exposure or anything because they're playing in London. But for Brandon Cooks, like playing on fast tracks in his career and then just also playing in warmer weather has been something that, at least splits wise, is shown to have impact on the way that he separates for touchdowns. So for speed guys, I think it matters a little bit on fast tracks. So I guess it's a smaller knock, but I still prefer him the most just because of matchup. And then you take into account that he's $5,700 and the upside he has for GPPs. He's right now my favorite 5K wide receiver.
Jets at Jaguars, 6.5-point favorites for the Jags. Over under 41. We spoke about Leonard Fournette earlier being one of the highest owned projected running backs and highest owned players on this slate. But break this down, Sal. What are we looking at from the Jets side? And is Sam Sixth Sense Darnold, do you think he's recovered from what happened on Monday Night Football?
Yeah, hopefully he's recovered by now. I don't think it makes me too interested in him. I think Robbie Anderson has a really good matchup for parts of this game against Trey Herndon on the outside, who's been pretty bad this year, 328 yards and 2 touchdowns allowed. Robbie Anderson gets a ton of air yards. You know what you're getting out of Anderson. It's just a GPP hope for a deep touchdown, which you'll see probably once every 4 or 5 weeks. So I think Robbie Anderson's in play. Le'Veon Bell, I slightly prefer over Chris Carson right now. I think getting to Bell is okay here. I'm not going to have too much ownership on it. Like I said, this week, I'm going to go down a little bit and hope that Latavius Murray plays right now for all of my exposures, but getting to that range and then paying up at running back. But I think that Le'Veon Bell is completely fine. I'm not too worried about the last 2 weeks of his passing game role, only 5 targets going away. He still ran 51 routes over the past 2 weeks, which is enough for me to say that nothing's really changing. 28.5 routes run per week this season, and he's been running 25 and a half the last 2 weeks. So slightly a bump down, but nothing major. They were leading 2 weeks ago, so you don't really need him to run as many routes. So yeah, for the Jets, nothing really stands out outside of maybe some Robbie Anderson in a very loaded, cheap range of wide receivers. And Le'Veon Bell, I'll probably match the field, maybe come a little bit higher. I like where his ownership is at. Jacksonville, yeah. For Jacksonville, getting to Leonard Fournette, I think is completely fine. We talked about it earlier. We kind of broke that down. If you just joined, you can check the top of the show, but it's a really good play at the price point. If you want to kind of take your stance on him and have over the 20% or 18%, that's fine. I'd probably come in right around it, maybe a little bit lower. And then just looking through the rest of them, D.D. Westbrook's questionable. I probably don't get to D.D. this week. Tough matchup against Brian Poole in the slot, and I like a lot of other cheap receivers, although D.D. is cheap, so if you want to get there, it's fine. DJ Shark, I think, is in a very good spot on the outside, and Tremaine Johnson, who hasn't been great this year, improving the last 2 weeks, but he's questionable, so I think DJ Shark is in play.
I was going to tell you, one of my favorite plays this week, Sal, and I hate to say it because he kind of burned us the week that we were both on him, but I got to go with my man again and run it back is D.D. Westbrook. I know you mentioned the matchup against Poole not necessarily being one of the greatest, but I will say this, though. What we've seen lately with Westbrook is just a constant target machine and him just producing. 7 for 82, 6 for 103 in 2 of the last 3 games, and 2 red zone targets as well, which is always nice to see. But I got to tell you that, as much as Poole has been a great defender, in times where we've seen Poole match up in other areas, they have struggled significantly against the slot. I have seen Darryl Roberts go up there in the slot as well, and Darryl Roberts is obviously someone we want to attack. But if Darryl Roberts is also on DJ Shark most of the game, I think that's something to take into consideration as well. The Jets are not a great pass defense. Yes, they have Jamal Adams, who I think is elite talent there in the secondary at the safety position. But where they struggle is the passing game more than the running game when it comes to the defense. So I will say this, that I do think when it comes to tournament play and you're multi-entering and you're having a majority of entries, I don't mind Gardner Minshew and pairing him up with D.D. Westbrook or DJ Shark. I think there's a lot of vulnerability here in this Jets secondary. And I think, from what we've seen and seeing the connection between Westbrook and Minshew, I don't mind it one bit, Sal. And I think that this could be an area where more than what we saw, not too long ago. But I must say this, the Jets defense this year, Sal, when it comes to the wide receiver position, fantasy points allowed on DK, 37, 31, 56, 44, 41 in 5 of the 7 games this year. And so, when it comes to looking at this matchup, I think a lot of people will be heavy on Fournette, which allows leverage to these wideouts in this passing game as far as ownership is concerned, which could be sneaky plays in my opinion.
Yeah, right now, like these wide receivers are like not owned. You have DJ Shark somewhere on FanDuel around 5% owned. On DraftKings, he's right around there at 4% owned. So we know what DJ Shark can do down the field. I think it's fine. Yeah, if DD Westbrook plays, then there's some chances that a stack here can work out. I probably still lean to Leonard Fournette. So like for me, it's Leonard Fournette in spots. Probably will be around the ownership of the field, and then DJ Shark. It's just easy to get an ownership number that you feel good about him because if you have a 5% ownership, you're still over the field on both these sites. So yeah, I think it's an interesting spot for these guys. And I do agree, like the outside cornerbacks for the Jets, it's probably a bottom 5 talent group in the league.
All right, Sal, next game, Giants at Lions, 49.5 over under. Lions 7-point favorites. It's a high over under. And I say this because I'm not concerned about what the Lions can do on offense when it comes to the passing game, but I am concerned about the Giants offense. So I would love to hear what you have to say about D Jones, who has regressed since his Buccaneers start every single game, essentially. And then going to Evan Ingram, who I thought would be such a huge game last week. I mean, I was high on 2 tight ends last week, Waller and Ingram. And I thought Ingram had the better matchup, to be quite honest with you. I knew Waller would play from behind. I thought that there would be a lot of production to go his way, which it did. But man, I mean, Evan Ingram was such a disappointment. So break down this Giants offense. And are you seeing anyone here that makes sense of this 49.5 over under?
Yeah, so the Giants side, yeah, Daniel Jones, I don't trust him to be stacking a team. I don't really trust him to play him or any of his teammates. I think we've seen, and we might see it this week with Tannehill. If you're playing the Bucs and you have that pass funnel of a defense, it's a very good matchup, and you should be able to exploit it. So, and there's also really no tape on him that week as it was his first start. So, yeah, it's not a spot that I really want to get to Daniel Jones. I talked about Saquon. I'd rather get to Christian McCaffrey this week over Saquon if paying up, but I'll probably have a little bit above the field on both of them just because you have 2 stud running backs that are just going unnoticed right now. What that leaves me is for the rest of this Giants offense, no real interest in Golden Tate, who's going to draw the toughest matchup in the slot. Slay's not supposed to be playing, but even in the slot, you'll face Coleman. So Golden Tate, if he's going to be staying in the slot against Coleman for most of this game, it's a tough matchup for him. Coleman's been one of the better slot cornerbacks in the league. And then, yeah, Evan Ingram, at his price point of 5,300, I'm just going to be getting to Austin Hooper and Darren Waller in the exact same 5K range more. And then I'll probably even get to Zach Ertz more than Evan Ingram, just slightly for $200 less. He projects out a little bit better for me, and he's cheaper. So no real interest around. Obviously, getting to Evan Ingram as exposures, I'll usually have 5 tight ends. He'll be one of them. He'll probably come in 4th or 5th this week in the amount I get to him. It's just really Saquon, and I'll come in slightly above the field, which isn't going to be much this week. It'll probably be like 15% owned.
How about any love for the passing game? Is there any love for Golden Tate here in a revenge narrative coming back into Detroit?
Yeah, the revenge narrative. I didn't actually weigh that all that much, but I probably don't get there because I think Coleman's been very good in the slot. The only time that we've seen him kind of exposed was against Allen Lazard for that one quarter when Green Bay had Allen Lazard come in and have a deep touchdown, but Allen Lazard also caught a ball out of the slot, and he's a 6'5" wide receiver, which Golden Tate is nowhere near that. Coleman's going to have the advantage here. So I think it's a nice spot for Coleman on defense against Golden Tate. So I'm probably not going to get to Golden Tate. Also in that price range, it's just a little bit too expensive for me now.
So Galladay, would love to talk about this because what we saw the 2 previous games before that, a lot of production. He scored 2 touchdowns off 9 targets in one of the games against the Chiefs. Then he had 9 targets, 121 yards, 5 catches against the Packers. And then we turn around here and he has 1 catch, Sal, for 21 yards. And I say this because Matt Stafford, essentially, when it comes to throwing the ball, had his highest game of the season. What do you have? 364 yards and 4 touchdowns, and nothing went to Galladay. So what happened? And I want to ask you, is Galladay worth going back to this week? against what we've spoke about so far on this show of how bad this Jets secondary is.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to get to Galladay. I think he's one of my favorite wide receivers this week. So what happens last week? Yeah, you see 2 targets. One of them is a 2-point conversion target. So really just 1 target in play for a 21-yard reception. Yeah, it's not a spot that I think there's anything to really take away from it other than it's just kind of fluky. You see 45 pass attempts and only 2 targets for Kenny Galladay. I don't think we have to break it down or anything. There was no injury news coming out. I think maybe there was a little bit of double teams, which opens up Marvin Jones. But at the end of the day, I think it was just a fluky week where he has a bad game. But outside of that, he's been constantly seeing 9 to 10 targets a week. And now he has just as good of a matchup as you'll find against these Giants defensive backs. So probably for the majority of this game, who he's going up against, get to face a guy like DeAndre Baker, who's given up 409 yards and 3 touchdowns so far this year, 146 passer rating against. That's the worst in the league out of anybody who's played over 150 coverage snaps. So Kenny Galladay right now, I don't know exactly where he'll come out in exposures, but if I had to rank him, he would definitely be in my top 5 wide receivers this week.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, when it comes to these corners, DeAndre Baker, Janoris Jenkins, who gets most of the assignment when it comes to the passing game of the Detroit Lions? Who does Galladay see the most, and who does Tate see the most of the two? Or excuse me, Marvin Jones.
Yeah, so I think just like based on size, Galladay's taller, and usually what you'll see is if you don't really have a shutdown corner that's taller, they will put the guy who's the tallest on him and has some sort of skill set. None of these Giants guys really have any sort of skill set, but it's an undersized matchup for a guy like Janoris Jenkins if he's still even there. Apparently, going to be shipped off any day now in a trade. But it's going to be an undersized matchup for him. So I think you get DeAndre Baker for the most part in this game on Kenny Galladay, maybe some double teams, but I don't think they can afford to put too many double teams and leave Marvin Jones one-on-one with a guy like Janoris Jenkins. So I think that's where the matchups will line up. Janoris Jenkins on Marvin Jones and Baker on Galladay. And then in the slot, Danny Amendola will be in there against Grant Haley, who's been very bad. So I actually like the Lions. They'll probably be, if I had to just think about it, stacks that I think are interesting this week are Atlanta, Houston. I think Tampa Bay is actually interesting. And then a team like Detroit. One of my 4, probably top 4 stacks that I'll have ownership to is a Stafford, Galladay, and Marvin Jones type of a stack.
One last thing to take note, guys, that where they also get burned and torched is not just the cornerbacks, but the safety position on bombs thrown. So when it comes to air yards, we know Marvin Jones is one of the highest in the league, and especially on big play opportunities. And so Michael Thomas and Antoine Bethea, both safeties, you're looking at a tandem that combined collectively 141 passer rating against the two when the quarterback's thrown against them. You're looking at 8 of 10 completions for 80% for Bethea, 5 of 7, 71% for Thomas, both giving up touchdowns, both giving up a combined almost 300 yards. So if they're looking to throw, I mean, this could be a game where we see it kind of break out in the passing game, especially with Kerryon Johnson out. I don't think Ty Johnson gets the love that people are anticipating. I think how you win this game and the way that they win this game is through the air. So be mindful of that. And I love the call on Amendola, Sal. I think all wide receivers are in play here looking at this game. Next game, Bucks at Titans, 45.5, 2.5 point favorites for the Titans at home. You just mentioned, Sal, that you like the Bucks offense. Go ahead, man. Break it down.
Yeah, so I think it's not something that I'll have a ton of, but I do think when just the way that this Bucks offense is concentrated, and now with OJ Howard out, which he hasn't been playing well, but he's just somebody in the red zone that you have to account for. I think that just Chris Godwin and Mike Evans are clear cut, and there's not many spots on this slate where you have 2 dominating and clear cut wide receivers that Jameis Winston is going to throw to, or just your quarterback in general. So when it comes to stacking, yeah, Jameis can absolutely ruin your day. But we've seen so far there's weeks this season where, and especially coming off a bye, I trust it a little bit more, where he can actually win you a tournament. So Chris Godwin in the slot. It's going to be a tough matchup for Chris Godwin, but against Logan Ryan, who's been one of the better slot cornerbacks this year. He's played the most slot snaps in the league, only a 66 passer rating against. He's been very good there, but he's been facing undersized slot cornerbacks, and that's exactly what Godwin is not. Mike Evans on the outside. I prefer, if you're just picking one, I actually prefer Mike Evans, who should see a lot of Malcolm Butler due to Malcolm Butler being the bigger cornerback than Adore Jackson. And Malcolm Butler has not been good this year. 375 yards, 3 touchdowns given up on 44 targets, 29 receptions. So I like both those guys. So when I see 2 wide receivers that I really like in a week, it just makes me get to the quarterback more. They're not getting owned at all right now. So I do like Tampa Bay stacks as sort of a contrarian option to go to with high talented wide receivers. And then on the opposite side, it's a side that a lot of people are just talking a lot about because, yeah, you have this Tampa Bay pass funnel. So a lot of people are just talking about, oh, it's Ryan Tannehill week. I think if this game goes how it's expected to, and Tampa Bay's stout run defense stops Derrick Henry, if that actually happens, Ryan Tannehill probably has to throw the ball 35 to 40 times. That's a bit concerning to me. He's looked really good, but he only threw 29 times last week, only played a quarter and a half the week before that. So it could be a lot worse than people are expecting. I don't really want to stack too many Tennessee lineups. But again, we saw what Daniel Jones did against this defense. It's a really bad defense. So if you want to get there, that's fine. I prefer Corey Davis slightly to A.J. Brown, but I like both of those receivers. I think Corey Davis is one of the best GPP plays on the slate at no ownership and a really good matchup, size and speed, and the clear number one target right now for Ryan Tannehill. So, yeah, I like stacking really both sides of this. I prefer Tampa Bay for just lower ownership and probably higher upside. And, yeah, I think that neither running back really stands out. I think Derrick Henry has a really brutal matchup.
Yeah, I mean, we know about the Tampa Bay front four and stuffing the run. I mean, they're one of the best rush defenses in the league, and we haven't really seen many running backs produce against them. In fact, they've been one of the best when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the running back position. But where they've struggled is through the air. The secondary is just not that good, Sal. And I think these calls on all these wide receivers, I think all of them are in play. I think what is key is how you kind of differentiate yourself is the amount of exposure that you allow to them. But I think where you attack the most, I mean, you're looking at Vernon Hargraves and maybe MJ Stewart, two guys on their depth chart that have really gotten torched. I think almost 700 yards and 4 touchdowns between those two guys. And I mean, there hasn't been a week where this defensive unit, as far as the wide receiver position, Sal, I mean, they've given up at least 40 points to the wide receiver spot, fantasy points, DraftKings here. I think in 6 of 7 games. And I mean, in the last 5 games alone, they've given up 40, 55, 78, 44, and 37. So I agree. I think the way that Tennessee wins this game is through the air. I think they'll try to establish the run, but it might not necessarily work in their favor. I think Derrick Henry will still get his carries. He might take some goal line carries away, but nothing to discredit Tannehill. I'm not going to say that Tannehill's a great play, but he just has a really good matchup. And at home, I feel like the game plan with how they're going to utilize him, we saw last week, not scared to throw it, not scared to take chances. I think A.J. Brown, Corey Davis, all these guys are in play. And, to be quite honest with you, I think these guys are interesting for GBP.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And yeah, I like, and when I say like I like Corey Davis more than AJ Brown, it's barely. Like I expected Corey Davis to be highly owned this week, and he's like 7% owned, and AJ Brown's 8% owned. So they're both going unowned right now. I prefer Corey Davis slightly there, but I think AJ Brown, like in terms of like overall careers, is just going to be the guy if they both stay healthy to be the more successful player. But when it comes to this week, Tannehill's been looking Corey Davis's way a little bit more. I think both are viable. But yeah, you mentioned it. It's a really good matchup for Tannehill. I think a sneaky overall game stack for sure when they have a total of a 46.5. It's not low enough that I don't like it. You have a 24.5 it opened as a total for Tennessee this week, which is surprising, 22 for Tampa Bay. So, yeah, I think there's options here, clear options to get to a 4-man game stack. On both sides, run back options are pretty decent to good.
I think, where we have to see the biggest matchup is maybe that front four and the blitz packages and the pressure that they get on Tannehill. I think last week what we saw was Los Angeles just not getting to Tannehill enough. He had a lot of time in the pocket, was able to make throws. And I mean, to be quite honest with you, do you think we'll ever see a game as far as the level of the execution that Tannehill had? I'm not sure. I mean, but, this will be a test this week where it's not a good defense. So it might be a really cake matchup for him. And if the Bucks can't get to him, he might be able to really produce once again. So I think he's in play. Next game, Eagles at Bills, 1.5 point favorites from the Bills, 42 over under. So we're looking at two teams here. The Bills they can't run the ball. However, though, they have a great defense. And on the other side of the ball, we have the Eagles, who really just have a horrible passing defense and can't stop the run. So where the hell do we go in this game?
Yeah, so right now what you have is it's sort of a gross game here. So like on the Philly side, they continue to have more injuries on their defensive line. Hassan Ridgeway is going to be out for the season, a defensive lineman. They're already without a couple of guys out for the season. Malik Jackson out indefinitely, no timetable on a guy like Tim Jerrigan. So their defensive line, even though it's been very good against the run, we might start to see in a couple of weeks that it just starts to slowly unravel. They still have great players on it, but when you're losing three of your top run stoppers and really guys on that line, it starts to get harder to keep up with. We know the secondary's been bad. They got Jalen Mills back last week. He actually looked okay on Amari Cooper. He had an interception. Cooper just made some really good catches over him. It wasn't really bad defense. So I think that can hurt John Brown a little bit. But the biggest piece from this game for me is really just John Brown. I think Josh Allen has a clearly good matchup. The price tag on Josh Allen, though, is just 6,500, and I'd rather go down to Matt Ryan or just go up to Deshaun Watson's range, or even maybe a Jared Goff, where I think they have better weapons to throw to when it comes to team and game stacking. So, yeah, it's really just John Brown in this game. On the Philly side, nothing really stands out. Tough matchup for all the players going into Buffalo as underdogs. I think Zach Ertz is probably my third favorite tight end this week because he's just not getting any ownership, and I have him projecting out. I think somewhere in the mid to high 13-point range. So he becomes like a third interest of mine in terms of where I think I'll get to him in exposures. And I think that something somebody pointed out earlier in the week to me was it's a really good matchup for Josh Allen. Why can't I just play him with John Brown? And I think you can. Like, you don't always have to full on team and game stack, but the point being there is, like, there's been research done. People have the data. I have some of the data as well. If you full on team and game stack, you have a much better chance of winning GPPs. So the thought process is when you don't do it, you're literally giving up your better edge to winning a GPP. So it doesn't always have to happen. So for the people that say, like, oh, you can just play no stacks or just a quarterback and wide receiver and win, you can, but you have a less likely chance of winning. So why not take the greater chance of winning is all that the argument is on that side.
Yeah, I mean, Ertz has had probably the most disappointing years so far as level of expectation and what we saw in career numbers last year. One touchdown this year, has yet to get over 100 yards receiving this year as well. Does poise a difficult matchup when it comes to the Bills pass D and the way that they neutralize the tight end position. I think one thing about Josh Allen is, I mean, he's always going to have a high A dot, right? He had one of the highest last year. He's in line to have one of the highest this year. You're looking at a quarterback that's a dual threat guy. But when it comes to the weapons, I mean, you got John Brown. And outside of that, you don't really have much. And so it's, when I look at this matchup, it's like you would want to attack this passing defense. And I guess there is the ability there for him and Brown to really have a decent correlation type of matchup. But when it comes to thinking about winning a GBP, I just don't know if this is the right correlation that'll get you there. I feel like there are other correlations that are better suited to put you in line to win, such as the Millie Maker. So I don't hate the play. I just don't know if I have the confidence that that correlation will be the type of correlation to help take down a GBP, in my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, I think John Brown, if you're just taking him as an individual play, is okay. I think that trying to force in a Buffalo stack is probably not going to work out.
Carolina Panthers at 49ers. Be going to the late games now. 42.5 over under, 5.5 point favorites for the 49ers. Man, I mean, what's there to say that this 49ers defense is pretty legit? They've really shown us that they're for real. I will say that Garoppolo is not necessarily your fantasy quarterback. He is a great game manager. He is a great real life quarterback when it comes to being a quarterback to control the game, to move the chains. Let's talk about this, Sal. Christian McCaffrey's in this matchup. Do we go here?
Yeah, I like Christian McCaffrey. Look, I know that this defense has been good for the 49ers, but their run defense, it just, I think it's a little bit skewed. And I think I don't want to say fake good, but I think it's kind of fuzzy, these stats. So teams have only ran the second most times against them. So when you just look at overall yardage given up, that's the reason why, because teams just aren't running because they're down pretty big in these games. And they've had a lot of positive matchups to where they get out ahead because of their defense, whatever it might be. So I think Christian McCaffrey coming off of a bye, fully rested, is the best spot you're going to find for him in terms of his own health outside of like the first game of the season. I think it's a nice spot. According to Pro Football Focus, San Fran's run defense is only ranked 21st. So the Patriots allow the least rushing yards in the league, but that's because they also have the least rushing attempts against them. I think that this game between Carolina stays a little bit more competitive. We know McCaffrey is just as involved in the passing game as on the ground. And if it's a week where Christian McCaffrey, the last time I checked, and I'm going to look it up right now, if it's a week where Christian McCaffrey's ownership numbers are coming in below average, it's just a week where I'll definitely get to him. Yeah, he's below average. He's at 14% owned right now. It's a week where I'll get to him. I'll probably come in around 20%, if not more, and just bet on the talent there in a matchup that I think people think is worse than it is. Like, this pass rush is definitely good. This pass defense is definitely good. Their running defense, I think, is the spot that is where you beat them, and that's just more benefit to Christian McCaffrey. Outside of that, no real interest in this team of Carolina. On the San Fran side of the ball, I think Tevin Coleman is a decent pivot away from Ty Johnson. at a similar price range. They honestly probably play the same amount of snaps, if not Tevin Coleman playing more snaps than Ty Johnson will in his game. So I think that that's nice. George Kittle, he's always fine to go to. He'll probably see 7 or 8 targets. I think I probably get to, and I will get to, Darren Waller and Austin Hooper more. So the biggest piece here is probably McCaffrey. I'm going to be over the field on him. And anytime there's a week to do that and you have a lot of value so it fits in easier, I think that I want to.
So I agree with you about McCaffrey. I think what concerns me is that when he's faced a tough rush defense, he's struggled to an extent. And I'm going to break down the Bucs defense because he's faced them twice. And so this is how we know that the Bucs defense is, when it comes to the rushing game, pretty legit. But 31 yards and 37 yards in those two respective matchups. However, though, in the second matchup, he did get in the end zone, both running and receiving. Not a lot of yardage, but it did salvage his overall, production. And so, but here's the thing, and I kind of want to take a play out of the playbook last night in NBA and cross sports. Karl Anthony Towns was the highest, leverage play last night as far as the highest projected ceiling. And obviously, as we know, on a week-to-week basis, when it comes to projected ceiling, it's what gets you as far as a tournament win, or if that player exceeds that, then it puts you in good line. If he's 20% owned or sub 20%, and knowing that currently right now he's the highest projected ceiling running back, is this a leverage play knowing that 4/5 of the field wouldn't have McCaffrey? And if you have McCaffrey, it really kind of separates you if he does essentially go off and cap that ceiling.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's definitely, he has the highest ceiling on the slate at running back. When the guy is averaging 32 fantasy points per game this year, and it's not like he had one 70-yard game or 70-point game, and obviously I'm exaggerating, but he's had multiple 40-plus point games. He's had a 30-point game. Like his 31.72 fantasy points per game this year, nobody else is even close. I mean, Leonard Fournette's at 19 second there. Austin Eckler's had good games, but now Melvin Gordon's back. Like the guy's ceiling is clearly high because of the role in his offense. He touched the ball 37 times a couple weeks back. His role is just the number one wide receiver and the number one running back in an offense that is going to come off a bye against a defense that, I think those matchups against the Bucs, like I believe in the Bucs run defense is the tout or the top number one stout run defense. And I think they just got Jason Pierre-Paul back as well. So that's going to make it even more of a better defensive front. Whereas with the 49ers, I think they definitely are good at generating pressure. I think they're definitely good in the secondary. I'm not too sure I buy into them being like a top 5 or maybe even a top 5 run stopping defense at the end of the day. I think right now they just haven't faced a lot of not good running backs. It's just in general, just not a lot of attempts, second least in the league. So I think that your point on the leverage is exactly right. And I'll be playing him to out leverage the field and hope for one of those types of games.
2 games left. And guys, before we break down these final 2 games, if you want to start asking questions so Sal and myself can answer them, go ahead and do so in chat. And for anyone who just recently joined us over the last hour or so, if you can, give this a thumbs up, like this. We continue to produce content daily, hourly here at Awesemo.com, and we can't do this without you guys. So we just want to thank you once again. Continue to give us a thumbs up, subscribe, like this, and share, because without you guys, we can't keep helping you guys take your game to the next level. So once again, we appreciate you guys for that. Oakland Raiders at Houston Texans, 51.5 over under, the highest on the slate, I believe. 6.5-point favorites for the Texans. We've talked about this game a lot already because of where the ownership stands amongst some players from the Houston Texans side. You said about game stacking, Sal, that this is a game where you're attacking as far as game stacking. Let us hear it and break this down.
Yeah, I think it's just you have 2 wide receivers that have upside. And I mean, the matchup just in general for guys like Hopkins and Kenny Stills on the outside is great. You get Kenny Stills' cheap price point to kind of take off the pressure of the higher price Deshaun Watson and higher price DeAndre Hopkins. So I think it's a good spot to game stack. I think a lot of other people will too. It'll probably be heavily owned. So that being the case, I'll still come in heavy on it, but it won't be like one where I just fully own this game stack and not any other ones. It'll be like a top 2 own game stack for me. I like Atlanta as well. I like Tampa. I like Detroit. I like those spots as well. So it's just really good spots for DeAndre Hopkins. We broke it down earlier in his matchup against probably Travion Mullen for parts of that game. Kenny Stills will get Darryl Worley. Really good spots. Kiki in the slot, you mentioned, he'll have some upside around the red zone as well. So if you want to get to there in some of your groups, I think it makes sense to put Kiki in your groups. But I probably don't get as much exposure as the outside guys. I think Deshaun Watson's a number 1 play on the slate at quarterback this week. I don't think it's going unnoticed. So I think right now he is the highest owned quarterback. So it's no surprise. We saw what Aaron Rodgers did last week. They get rid of their top secondary player on the defense, and now he's going to the Texans this week in Conley. So just a really good overall matchup. I do think that Carlos Hyde is extremely sneaky this week. He's a cheap price point, and everybody's going to be on the passing attack, and I probably will too. But having shares of Carlos Hyde is something that I want. It's just the exact leverage spot of a high-owned spot that you want. He's a guy who will probably continue to see 60% of the snaps and see 15 to 20 touches in this game on the ground. I do like the spot for Hyde as well. So I just like the whole offense. This is a really bad Oakland defense. We saw both Packers running backs get in the end zone last week against them.
Yeah, I think Hopkins, Kiki, and Stills are all in play. Obviously, I think where you attack this this game is this passing offense more than the running game of the Houston Texans. And I think one thing to take note is I really project and predict that the Texans really run route here in this game. And in doing so, I think that Darren Waller is once again a good leverage play because of the game script and them needing to pass. I don't necessarily know about Josh Jacobs this week in the matchup. The last few weeks, he's been able to really show us his first round draft potential and that he's a legit elite talent at the running back position. But when it comes to the defense for the Houston Texans, a little bit better compared to what we've seen over the last 2 weeks as far as the running back spot. They kind of neutralized the running back position to some extent, as they have over, I think, 4 of the 7 games this year. And so I think from what we see, I think the only person I like is Darren Waller. He's a hybrid. He's not just a tight end. I feel like he is a wideout, and the way that he plays and the way that he's put into passing schemes is like a wideout. So it provides huge upside for the tight end position. And outside of that, though, I really think there's nothing else. Any love for the Houston Texans defense, Sal?
Houston Texans defense, I probably won't get there. Like, I'm not going to prioritize them or really if it's a cheap home defense that has or is a favorite or in a neutral spot, I'll get it to them. Nothing stands out for their defense. I agree with you on Waller. He's the main guy that I run back stacks with. Tyrell Williams is due back tentatively. But either way, even if Tyrell Williams was to play, I don't think he's going to be healthy. These types of foot injuries will impact the player. Just look at AJ Green, even Devontae Adams this year. Not the same foot injury, but foot injuries in general, they'll impact wide receivers for the entire season. And no real interest there. Josh Jacobs hasn't been practicing this week. He might play. He doesn't have to practice, they said, to play. But yeah, I agree with you on that as well. Same price point as Latavius Murray. If Kamara's out, much rather get there. Darren Waller right now is my number 1 tight end. And yeah, it just makes it easy to run it back in game stacks with him here. So yeah, Waller's the main guy as opposed to these run back options with the Houston Texans stacks.
Our final game, Sal, Cleveland Browns at New England, over under 44.5. Big 10.5 point favorites at home. This New England Patriots defense, man, I really have nothing to say but great things. I think Gilmore is the best cornerback in the league. I think that the way that they really put pressure on the actual offenses, opposing offenses, and the way that they're shutting down the passing game and really just stuffing the run is absolutely incredible. I really don't know what the Browns can do in this matchup, but I will say, I talked about it earlier, I think Sony Michel is in a really good spot against this Browns rush defense. Let's go ahead and hear what you have to say, Sal. Anyone from this game, and is there anyone from the Browns side as far as maybe trying to play catch up in a game where I project to be really blown out? Any love for these wideouts in Odell or Jarvis?
No, so I know Odell's price is coming down, but yeah, I mean, I'd rather get Kenny Galladay at like the exact same price point. We already talked about it and you touched on it. Stephon Gilmore is fantastic. McCourty this year has been just as good. It's not a spot that I really want to target Cleveland. I get it. They'll all be low owned, but I just think there's better spots on the board. And if one of them happens to have a good game, I still think that good game might not outscore other spots that you're going to get better positions for, and even at cheaper price points. So Cleveland, I really am not getting anything right now. Going into Foxborough as well is like 2 touchdown underdogs, not great. New England, I like Mohamed Sanu. So we'll see like what his role is if we get any news on that. If it's going to be limited, then yeah, I don't like it. But at 4,000 going unnoticed, he's going to operate probably on the outside. And we just know that in this offense, whether it's Josh Gordon, whoever it is that plays on the outside has upside. Even Philip Dorsett, I imagine that Julian Edelman goes back to the slot if Sanu is indeed going to take on a full role in this offense. They're huge favorites, so it's not as good for the wide receiver, but they're going to score points. So there's upside there for Sanu. And then, yeah, the running backs, Michelle and James White on the ground. My only hesitation with James White is you know what you're getting out of him. You're not getting a lot of carries. You're not getting a lot of red zone carries. You might get like 8 targets out of James White, but more times than not, it's like 4 or 5 catches for 40, 50 yards. So I think sure, that's a nice floor, but that's also what this guy is he just turned into now at this point. He's not really running the ball as much on the ground. So at 5,100, it's fine, but you're paying $5,100 for pretty much like a middle of the pack wide receiver, like an Alex Erickson almost. So I'd rather just pay for that if you're going for the flex. for a guy who's going to see similar targets. So I get it that James White is very productive as a running back out of the backfield, but when you don't pair that with anything in the running game, it's really hard to get to. So I prefer Sony Michel to James White this week. He has 24 red zone carries on the year. That leads the slate with Leonard Fournette and I believe Christian McCaffrey. So from the Patriots, a little bit of Mohamed Sanu and a little bit of Sony Michel, especially as a pivot off of Ty Johnson if you're not somebody who is believing in Ty Johnson as much.
I think the two areas to attack here are Julian Edelman, Cleveland, one of the worst against the slot wide receivers. And over the last 4 games, Sal, they've given up 3 touchdowns and an average of 16.1 fantasy points to the slot wide opposition. But to go into even greater depth, I mean, you're looking at an offense of the Patriots that likes to throw short dump offs, likes to run slants and slots, and really just attack defenses, not in the big ball, but in the low ball. And that's where Cleveland has struggled in these short yardage passes. So I think Edelman, for him, someone who does get a lot of targets, someone who is looked upon as a primary option for Brady, I think is in a great spot. And I think the best play in this game, so I spoke about it earlier, I think is Sony Michel. He's 5,200. I mean, he is in the comparison price point range of Jordan Howard, Joe Mixon, Melvin Gordon, Ty Johnson, someone who's projected to be highly owned. Guys who don't even see nowhere near the same production or opportunity as Sony Michel. And, as we've seen, over the last couple of weeks, if you look at what Chris Carson did against the Browns rush D, if you look at what the 49ers did with Breida and Coleman on Monday Night Football, absolutely torched them on the ground game. Very weak there. They can't stop the run. And if you're looking at a game plan of how the Patriots operate, they're a run-first team. And so basically, essentially what we're looking at here is a running back that's priced at 5,200 that's getting at least 15, 16 carries a game. And also the biggest thing to take note is if you look at his last, if you look at his rushing red zone attempts over the last, 3 games, let's just say 3 touchdowns, but in those games, 6 attempts, 2 attempts, 4 attempts. So, that's 12 attempts in 3 games, an average of 4 a game. They're giving him the ball in the red zone. I think that's the biggest key, especially at a 5,200 price point. I think he can more than pay off. And the way this game script I feel is going to go is they're going to dominate. I think Baker Mayfield is someone who's been very inaccurate. I think he's going to turn over the ball quite a bit against this great pass D of the Patriots. And I think that's going to give short yardage opportunities to get into the end zone for Michel. So 5,200, I feel like is a great, great spot for Sony Michel. And I think is a must play in my opinion, especially in GBPs.
Yeah, I think Sony Michel's in a good spot. The main thing that I would say is just watch Rex Burkhead. He's been questionable the last couple of weeks, hasn't played. He's questionable once again this week. So I would just track Rex Burkhead's status coming into this one, because if he plays, it might be a little bit of a dink to the overall snap counts for Michel. But yeah, it's nearly a 2-touchdown home favorite. That's a spot that you want to get running backs in terms of just having touchdown upside.
All right, guys, that's it for week 8 of the main slate. Any final questions before we go ahead and cram these last few hours before a lock tomorrow, guys? And Sal, as people are writing in their questions, where can we find you and let everyone know about things that you're doing right now?
Yeah, so you can find me here on Osmo on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 11 a.m. for NFL content. Osmo at Wednesday with Josh at 9:30 a.m. for the NBA strategy show. And then I have a YouTube channel. It's just Sal Vetri. You can check that out. Just do more fantasy-related content. And then Twitter at Sal Vetri DFS.
All right, guys. And for myself, at Chris Randone on both Twitter and Instagram. Any other questions, last-minute thoughts before we go ahead and end this show, guys? I'm not seeing much, Sal, but I will say this, guys. Is Fournette a good option?
Yeah, I think Fournette's a good option. Yeah, so like my final stance on him is like the way I'm building my lineups is just I want to get to a bit more expensive running backs this week when they're going to be lower owned and just build different lineups. So like getting to a Christian McCaffrey probably means I don't get to Fournette in those lineups. And a lot of that will be dictated by Latavius Murray's status, but I think he's still a good option depending on how much you want to get to him.
Russell Wilson over 300 yards passing, Sal.
I will say no.
Should I start Connor and Chase Edmonds and Ty Johnson? Is that good?
I don't know what the other options are, but out of those three sound pretty decent. Like Ty Johnson in season long, he's fine to get to, especially if you're like in a bind.
Jared Goff or Matt Stafford?
I'll take Matt Stafford there.
Someone asked, where do you get projected percent owned for these tournaments? Brent God, you can find it at osmo.com. It's under the ownership projections. And for people who don't know, last year by a third party, was measured. Awesemo.com ownership projections were the most accurate. So if you're looking to get involved, code NFL strategy, get 50% off your first month. It's one of the tools and resources that we use here at awesemo.com. And the last one, Ertz or Jonnu Smith?
I'll take Ertz there.
All right, Ertz. Well, guys, listen, we appreciate your time. Once again, please like this. Please share, subscribe, get notified for every single show so that way you know when it starts and you don't miss out. Once again, we appreciate everything. Sal, thank you for joining us as well. As for tomorrow, good luck, everyone. Play good players. Let us know how you do, and we appreciate